Welcome to Five Phenomenon Podcast. I am your host, Shane Hayes, and with me again this week, Ted.
Yes, Ted Haycraft.
Ted Haycraft. I should just announce our topic right up front. This week we're discussing it's some of our pet topics. It's funny because you were very at first like, are we gonna have enough to talk about, or are we gonna? It's me talking about Star Wars and you talking about Jack Kirby.
Well, yes. I mean, you have witnessed. I have done I have created a panel talk, or what would you call it?
Well, before we go into the actual topic, let's get real briefly. What did you watch this week? Because I think we're not entirely in the same boat. You have been seeing some movies at the theater, but I went and finally saw my second theatrical movie of post-pandemic 2020 because our town got Mank finally, and I know you saw it too.
Yes, I did.
What'd you think?
Oh boy, that's a can of worms. Well, first of all, it's one of those films my expectations are way too high. Number one.
Sure.
Number two.
But I had talked to you before this. You seemed prepared for it. I
was trying to prepare myself because the reviews. I mean, even the two-page Time review by what's her name, Stephanie.
Stephanie Zacharek.
Right. She even seemed to pull back a little bit, even though they literally have 2 pages to write about it. And that's the thing. There's a lot to be said about this movie. It's a lot to digest. At this point right now, this very hour, this day, I don't love the film, but I like the film. I think it's too smart for its own good in some ways.
I came away very concretely having to remind myself that it's a solid, entertaining movie. I think I had heard, I'd seen some bad reviews, and in the back of my head, my hope was stupidly and perversely hoping that this is a David Fincher movie that people didn't get, like people didn't get Zodiac when it first came out. And unfortunately, that was not the case. And one thing, just on a personal level, I'm really proud of is that we did our episode about Pauline Kael's Raising Cain essay, and I hope people go back to check it out, not just because we talked about the same topic that the movie is based on, but I think we did a good job because there's a lot of instances of things we talked about that the movie just bought the Pauline Kael essay hook, line, and sinker, and the movie's kind of full of shit on it. And the other problem basic problem I have with the movie is a general one of perfectionist directors. They're not all Kubrick. And when you see a perfectionist director make a big deal, I kept watching Mank and wondering, it took 100 takes to get this for a movie that's, I don't want to say mediocre because it's very entertaining, but it just seems like the technique that they dedicate themselves to, like it has the really interesting sound design of it trying to mimic the feeling of going to a theater, which I hope when it comes out on Netflix that translates to like your 6th channel, but for the most part, it just seems like they're putting everything in the front channel with a little bit of echo. And the movies in CinemaScope, which was not popularized, even if it was available at the time,
it was a strange. The manager at the theater was actually wrestling with what ratio he should show the thing in.
Really?
Yeah,
because it was often on when I saw it.
He showed it. We actually, before the movie started, he actually rented 2 different aspect ratios for me. Trying to help me decide what you think is better.
Because what I saw was letterboxed.
Yeah, it was. That's what we opted for. But I mean, they both had black around it. But he said it was a strange ratio for him to play with.
Yeah, and I mean, I like the end of the day. I think you've heard the stories that this was Fincher's directing a script by his father.
His father writing it. His father was a journalist, and I think that has a lot. I think that's a big thing that enlightens it or hampers it, or however you want to say it. That I think you have to keep that in mind.
And the movie's clever too, which is odd.
It's very clever. I think it's almost too smart for it's good. I'm really curious to see if anybody, a general movie goer who's not in the cult of Orson Welles or the cult of Pauline Kael or the cult or any of those cults, just to, I want to know a movie about Hollywood with Gary Oldman. I want to watch it. I would wonder. I'm curious to see what their reaction is going to be, because you and I are sitting there, and
we know all these stories.
40,000 things are going through our head, trying. Oh, is this that and.
Well, one basic thing that really did get on my nerves is that it was just like, it's a good idea not executed fully through. Is most every scene open and close very similar to the way Citizen Kane does, where they would do fade outs but manually on set, to where the set's lights would come down before the thing edited down, and then they'd highlight with one piece of light in the set itself. In Citizen Kane, it's not a technique they use that often, and when they do, it's a transition into the next scene often. Like very famously, the movie opens with Xanadu. You see the same window in the exact same spot in the frame at the very beginning. In this version in Mank, it's just very episodic, because every scene, especially at the end when they start intercutting sequences, flashback sequences on purpose, each scene fades in and out very episodically.
And the typeface comes about.
Yeah,
like a script.
the screenplay slug line.
Yeah, it's, I don't know. It's a real curiosity. It's not a Zodiac. But I think it's a unique novelty of film.
Yeah, it's not a Zodiac, but it's also, I have no one to agree with me on this. It's also not Benjamin Button. It is not a distinctly bad David Fincher movie.
Is Benjamin Button the?
I can't stand Benjaman Button.
You know what
It is a very beautiful movie, but it is a ridiculous dramatic movie.
This just hit me now discussing this. I almost would want to see a follow-up movie to Mank, and it shows the Orson Welles point of view, the matchup, the back and forth. Because
I was also judging some of doing the instance where I judged some of the interviews where. We did this whole episode on Pauline Kael's essay, which is Search the Authorship, and we go into details of who believes what research says what, and the conclusions by most people that done the research is that it was a co-written screenplay. And Fincher made some glib comment about how Orson Welles, never wrote a movie as good as Citizen Kane, so that's why Herman J. Mankiewicz wrote it, which is just... Herman J. Mankiewicz didn't write as good a movie as Citizen Kane. His next movie was Pride of the Yankees.
Yeah, that makes me think of our upcoming subject in Stan Lee. But anyway, what did you think? Is the American his original Manx draft out there to be read?
Yeah, I have it actually.
Without it being.
I didn't read all of it. I've read big chunks of it. It's just, it's not your traditional first draft in that it's unshaped in fat. It's just longer in fat, but it's a long first draft. And as I pointed out in the episode, twofold. One, half of good writing is what you choose to edit, and then you have sequences like in Citizen Kane, the marriage breakfast sequence where you get where you go back and forth between the couple arguing over a year, and that is an amazing epic or a sense of good elliptical editing. Like that's something that comes in when you edit down a longer version of it. And if you want to say Mankiewicz wrote the raw material and built it up and someone broke it down, I don't think the research backs you up on it, but fine. That still shows you just don't understand what writing is if you're going to make that argument.
Do we know for sure is there proof that Mank said that to Wells, that this is the best thing I've written, so I want to credit? Do we know that? Or is that just a conjecture?
No, Wells' original contract said that he had to get credit for everything, including writing. And the original contract he gave with Mank, who had already was writing some RKO radio drama up to that point, was going to give him credit. And then he started realizing it was going to be good, and he asked for credit. And he started to go for a guild arbitration for it, but backed off on it for some of the reasons illustrated in there. But by several accounts, Wells was the one that wrote down that Mankiewicz should get credit and gave it to him. And the proof being in the pudding, Mankiewicz is credited over Wells. They were credited alphabetically. On top of the fact, which I point this out, it's so obvious to me why you can't use Citizen Kane as a credit hog. One of the amazing instances, Wells' credit is shared with Greg Toland.
Well, yeah, that's the big thing.
So we've gone that long talking about Jack Kirby and Star Wars, but there was a lot to talk about. I highly recommend everyone go check back out our Pauline Kael's Raising Cain episode. I was pretty proud of that.
I don't think you even mentioned Jack Kirby and Star Wars yet. That's just off the top. Did you?
I thought I did.
Oh,
I said yeah. I said you like Jack Kirby. I like Star Wars.
Okay.
Yeah.
I got Mank in the mind now.
Mank's on the brain.
You've distracted me so much now.
All right. So with that in mind, let's jump right in. So as long as we've been hanging out, I have these memories of some of our first really post college, maybe after I left and came back. Some of our most intense sessions were based around being at West Side Denny's, and you told me this is where you really were trying to educate me on your love of Jack Kirby. And Kirby's obviously an artist you grew up with. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot to say.
Yeah, I mean, well, my first, one of my ground zeros in comic book reading and collecting is Fantastic Four number 57.
Is that the Silver Surfer Doctor Doom one?
Yes, it's after the Galactus trilogy, where this is going to be, if you don't know comic book history, the comic book lore, it's just so much to throw at you. But Galactus was kind of like it's like the Fantastic Four meet God, so that was a big deal. That was around issue 50. I came in as a kid. I started around 57. That's where this character called the Silver Surfer is his powers are zapped by Doctor Doom, and they fight the FF. And the Fantastic Four was just a mother lode of ideals. It's entire about a little bit over 100 issue run. Black Panther came out of there. The Inhumans came out of there.
Well, do you want to illustrate or mention what titles did Kirby co-create for Marvel?
Well, basically, this is a new thing I was actually spouting to one of my fellow comic book geeks, was that basically the pantheon of the Silver Age Marvel universe of the 60s, that almost everything is still the foundation for it. There's hardly been any later day heroes that match that pantheon. I mean, Wolverine, Punisher, there's a few, but Fantastic Four, X-Men, Hulk, Iron Man,
Thor, right?
Thor, yes. All these the
Silver Surfer, which you mentioned,
were then that's a whole. We can spend a whole other 2 hours on just the whole controversy of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby sharing the credit.
We'll get a little into it.
So anyway, and I actually want to say, and then it's like only characters that he didn't really have a touch on, where Doctor Strange and Spider-Man are Steve Ditko.
Even though he did have some designs for Spider-Man.
Well, I was going to say, and Daredevil is kind of Jack didn't really have much to do with that, but that said, he touched all three of those, actually, in a way. There was original Spider-Man design. He did some pages, but he wanted to go a different way with Spider-Man. And so he tossed it over to Steve Ditko, and it was a whole new refit on that. And then Doctor Strange, Stan actually says on print that this is a character of Steve Ditko's, but they had a character called Dr. Droom before that Kirby and Stan did, and it's basically Doctor Strange is a reworking of Doctor Droom, and then Daredevil. Jack did the cover, helped out on the cover of issue 1 on Daredevil. So it's almost because Stan was always having everybody draw like Jack. The dynamics of Jack. That was the house look, and so the whole Silver Age foundation, the MCU is basically a lot of Jack Kirby up on the big screen.
Okay, I imagine you're not want to go too in depth with this, but one of the fascinating things I found that I, as a lifelong comic book fan, wasn't aware, and you were able to illustrate to me whenever giving me these talks, was when Marvel really hit the Silver Age, there was really only was it 8 titles, and they were published by DC, and so there was ones that were bi-monthly that they switched around between.
Yeah, to make it look like they had more titles. What happened was Martin Goodman made a bad mistake. He put his investment to this distributor, and the distributor went belly up. And so all of a sudden, Martin Goodman, who is the publisher of Marvel Comics, started as a pulp magazine company, and then they got into comic books in 1939, 1940. He was the kind of guy, he see a trend. Oh, Westerns? Okay, Stan, put out 12 Westerns. War, put out 12 war. He was just a trend follower.
One of my favorite legendary story, he saw Justice League of America and said, according to Stan Lee's legend, which you can, depending on how well you trust it.
Yeah, there's several different stories there, but that's what the FF came out of. But what you're referring to is that, so Martin has no distributor. He he has to go to run to DC, and all the guys in the companies, the different competitors knew each other. and he goes to DC, goes, hey, can you help me out? I need to get my books in the stands. DC, sure. DC had their own distributor. Said, sure, but you're going to go 8 books a month. That's all you get. We'll help you out with. And you really can't do superheroes like the way we do superheroes. That's kind of a new wrinkle I read somewhere.
So how do you get around it?
Well, he wasn't doing superheroes at the time. That was when Ditko and Kirby were doing the monster books.
What happened in the 60s, though?
Well,
62, 63.
Your Justice League story comes into play there. Apparently, the one story is Martin's playing golf with the DC guys, and they're saying, "Oh, hey, our Justice League book is really selling well, and the sales are going up again." And DC had started bringing back their superheroes again.
So they just get relaxed on letting him publish superheroes?
Well, Martin comes back to Stan and says, "Give me a team book," because apparently Justice League. But if you read the first 2 or 3 issues of Fantastic Four,
it's kind of a science fiction thing.
The monster thing is still there on the cover. They're fighting a giant monster like they have.
Even the Thing is a monster,
right? There's no uniforms.
Okay.
The secret identity thing is they don't even have secret identities. So it was a slow evolution, but once the book started picking up speed and started selling, and like DC was like, why are these selling? And it's making money for DC, so it's kind of a catch-22 for them, you know.
Okay.
So yeah, and it's also there's a story that Stan's wife said Stan was about ready to give it up. Said, "Screw it, I've been 20 years and I want to be a writer. I want to write the American novel." And she goes, "Well, look, you have nothing to lose. Write something you like to write, you know." And so he came up with this, idea of the FF. And then of course there's the whole Kirby equation too.
Okay, well let's get ahead to we'll skip over like the 60s and the success in the 60s if you're okay with that.
Yeah, no.
What led to him? We're mainly going to be talking about in terms of Star Wars. Comic Kirby did called the New Gods that may or may not have influence on Star Wars. What led to Kirby going to DC?
Well, Steve Ditko had left. He butted heads with Stan on Spider-Man, and he was going to his Ayn Rand objectivism thoughts. So he just up and quit. They were not. There was merchandising being, cartoons being made, merchandising, promises that were maybe thrown out there, and Martin Goodman sold the company, and Jack never got what he thought he was deserving of all this stuff he was helped co-creating. And he would say he was actually plotting. The Marvel method is Jack would draw all 20 pages.
We're definitely going to get into the Marvel method later in this episode because one of the fascinating things I find. Okay, do you want to go ahead and just describe the Marvel method?
Well, the Marvel method is, the
Stanley's writing so many titles.
Well, yeah, he hasn't got a staff. Marvel hasn't become the big deal yet. So Stan's the editor and the writer for all the books. So he comes up with this idea. He goes, Jack, this issue, I got this character called Diablo, and they fight him, and maybe Sue and Reed have a fight. Go at it.
Well, sometimes it would be pretty like a half-hour phone conversation,
yes.
Semi-detailed, and sometimes it could be very like 2-word description.
Right. We don't.
I heard this great description the other day of Dave Gibbons talking about Frank Miller would often give him 2 words to Marvel method a story, and Gibbons would say it would end up being a great comic out of it too.
Well, and of course, when you're talking, somebody pointed out, I was reading some stuff about Jack and Stan just last night. Both of those guys have the worst memories, and there's even a whole book.
Yeah,
there's the John Marles of Tomorrow's Company has put out a book with he's gathered up all the interviews of Jack and Stan and put them all in chronological order, and to see how everything matches up and see what. It's an amazing book. It's an amazing.
But that's got to be just like.
And what they're.
We're gonna talk about Kurosawa later.
That's what Jack and Stan, what they thought writing meant, differed. The word of writing and plotting is, it would flow and flex a lot.
There's also that great documentary. What's the BBC guy did that documentary?
Jonathan Ross.
Yeah, and he gets Stan Lee on record saying, "Well, I came up with the idea. That's why I say I think I'm the creator."
Well, let me point out this thing. Another great artist on the legend and caliber of Jack Kirby is Wally Wood. They get Wally Wood to come to Marvel and start drawing Daredevil. He's the one who designs Daredevil's outfit to make it the red outfit that we all know Daredevil is. Wally finally says, "Wait a minute, I'm basically writing the entire issue and drawing it, and I'm not only getting paid once." he got kind of miffed at that and left because, these artists were basically drawing these pages without any kind of guide. It was up to them to get through 20, 21 pages. Then Stan would dialogue it.
Yeah, well, that's it. We need to mention that's a key, and that people who still use the Marvel method to this day still attribute that there's bad ways of doing it, and Stan Lee was very talented at it. And as we get into the New Gods, I was reading New Gods for the first time. When we were trying to get our research together, I couldn't get more than 3 issues, and you guys had warned me about it. But was New Gods Kirby's first solo writing dialogue?
Well, yeah.
He would suggest pieces of dialogue.
No, well, him and Joe Simon, he had a partner for a long time. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, they came up with Captain America in 1941. So he's with this Joe Simon. They were both artists, writers. They were both, and Jack was writing. But this is, this is the 40s, the 50s, and the writing was not as on a par as every decade. The writing got more sophisticated. So, yeah, but this is basically Jack's really debut with being the editor, writer, and artist.
Writing all the dialogue, I guess, would be the thing.
But we got distracted here. Let me go back. So, because you wanted to see how did Jack get the new guy, how he got the DC.
How he got DC, sure.
So, Jack's just disappointed. He's not getting what he wants. He starts talking to Carmen Infantino, who's the editor in charge at DC. They said, "Sure, yeah, come on over." They're thinking FF and Hulk and the success Marvel's had, and so Jack goes to DC. Jack had this idea. He's been sitting on it. He was going to give it to Stan and Marvel, but he was sitting on it because he was getting disappointed and he was getting disenchanted by working with Stan. He was going to end Thor. Thor was going to hit his Ragnarok, and out of that, the New Gods would emerge.
Okay.
So, and there's even an allusion to that generically in when the New Gods start at DC. So he moves to California. He's away off in California. Everybody's still based in New York City. That was another interesting factor to all this. He comes up with the New Gods, which he calls the Fourth World. If you hear the term Fourth World, we don't know, nobody can pinpoint why it's called the Fourth World, but he ended up doing 4 titles.
There's a great explanation in the Tom King, Mitch Gerard, Mr. Miracle series, which I'll talk about later myself. But.
So he comes up, they also want him to do a book that's entrenched into the DC universe, and Jack's such a nice guy, he doesn't want to kick anybody off the book. He goes, well, what's your lowest selling book? It was Superman's Pile, Jimmy Olsen. It was just in the dregs. So so he takes over that. And that's where the first Jack Kirby stuff starts, and the first appearance of Darkseid, the main villain of the Fourth World series, shows up in Jimmy Olsen. And then we get the New Gods.
He started out in Jimmy Olsen?
Yes, the first one is the Stands.
Oh, wow.
I missed him. I was as a kid. I'm 11 years old. I'm not looking at Jimmy Olsen. In fact, I wasn't looking hardly at DC's at all. I thought the world was coming to an end because Jack had left Marvel. I thought, how can Marvel exist? How can the FF go
on?
Well,
let's point out real briefly that one of the things I love pointing out when I tell people about Darkseid is that Thanos right now is a very popular character around the world. Like, philosophers are using he's one of the best Marvel MCU characters, at least in terms of motives. And the DC movie universe was trying to build up to him, and Marvel beat him. And Thanos is a ripoff of Darkseid.
Jim Starlin, the creator of Thanos, has no qualms to tell you. Yes, he was inspired, taken straight from Darkseid. He wanted to come up with a creature as evil and as big and mythic as Darkseid is.
Darkseid grew a lot, but it was funny reading some of his early appearances. I was thinking Thanos copter, like it was.
Well, even in the comic books, I guess Thanos got bigger too, because there's this big giant 2 annuals one summer where everybody fights Thanos. And he was becoming the bigger thing. DC didn't really utilize Darkseid till much later. In fact, it was a Legion of Superheroes comic that Darkseid shows up in the Darkness Saga. And now there's always been this problem, like who Superman's villains. You got this great gallery for Batman, but who's Toy Maker? I mean, Superman's got crappy
beyond Luthor and
Luthor. You got Luthor, but even so, now Darkseid has become like their go-to main bad guy of the DC universe, which is as interesting. So anyway, he has these 4 titles: New Gods, Mr. Miracle, Forever People, and Jimmy Olsen. And what was so amazing about this is that they were all working together and revealing this whole universe and this dark side. And there were two planets, so basically, I should say that Apocalypse and New Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
And you had the nice, happy, good guys and gods on New Genesis, and you had Darkseid and all his minions on Apocalypse.
Spelled with a K.
Right. And if you look at Apocalypse, it looks like a Death Star on fire, sort of.
We're going to get to that.
So,
I need to mention one real thing before we start to move on to Star Wars, and this is going to be the controversial thing that I usually like to tease you about, and it's the fact that we're doing an episode dedicated to Jack Kirby. I am not a Jack Kirby fan. The problem is that everyone loves Jack Kirby, cites him to this day. A lot of people I admire treat him as if he's the birth of imagination of the last 40 years for everything in pop culture sometimes. And as an artist, I see that he makes things look bigger and more boisterous. He's very good at like making action jump off the page. He's amazing when it comes to design and architecture. But when I was reading New Gods, half the time, I mentioned his writing. I had to stop reading his writing, so I was like reading the panels, story like panel by panel to do the storytelling. And his storytelling doesn't match up to someone like Ditko's, or there's a lot of modern people who, like, I think maybe do better. One area I'm curious what you think about on this, his comic book artists are oftentimes credited by the amount of emotional acting based on the expressions they can draw. Like, they're credited with the acting in a sequence, and he's got like 3 different faces he uses.
oh no, this is not. You're not talking an Al Williamson here. You're not talking, even Neil Adams. I mean, I think no, there are people there, there's superstars of the comic book industry that come out and say, I hate his dialogue in New Gods. They just absolutely hate it. So
Sure.
But the thing about Jack is you got to, if you put it in the perspective of he's almost until he dies in '94, he is the comic book industry. He is the centerpiece of the if you really want to be really eccentric and extreme, you could almost say that Jack saved the comic book industry in the '70s.
Or he saves superheroes.
Yeah.
And I mean, you're talking the '70s, but so much of his stuff is in the '60s.
Well, and that's another thing. I think you haven't read enough. I wonder, have you read
No, I really haven't. In fact, when you get to Fantastic Four, you mentioned Trial Galactus. That's really one of the biggest things of his I read. Around the time I was getting into comics, would have been late '90s, would have been his last stuff. That's when he was doing the stuff he was creating for Topps. And he obviously, to me at that time, looked very dated when like all the Image titles are coming out.
All I can say, and I don't mean this.
No, go for it.
But it's
Go
like,
for it.
think about Bob Dylan. There's a lot of people who can't stand Bob Dylan.
You had to go back.
Well,
to
I mean,
Bob.
no, but I'm saying, everybody loves To Make You Feel My Love. Adele singing it, or Garth Brooks singing it. All Bob's influence is just so monumental to music, and that's what Jack is. And if, whether you don't like Bob Dylan or not, you have to throw the props to them.
I'm just gonna leave it that there's a lot of people I admire who like Jack Kirby and think that.
So does that make you want to think? Well, I gotta see what they're saying.
Oh no, I've given that effort more times.
Have you read the Fantastic Four run?
Well, I read no. Okay, my point comes up in like the 3rd issue of New Gods. There's a sequence where it has light rays shooting. He's shooting light through these jewel-shaped stuff at Black Rider, which Black Rider is fascinating because is that like him being like, oh man, I didn't get enough credit on Silver Surfer.
That's sort of a Silver Surfer knockoff, yes.
Yeah, and he shoots through a crystal, and Kirby in the dialogue, one of the things that's so bad is, but it's you get it. We no need to harp on it. Is him telling what he's obviously showing and doubling up.
Well,
on
comic book writing was still that way. Stan was guilty of that.
He's not this bad, but anyway, one of the things when he shoots the light through it, he describes it as be creating lasers, and it's this thing that I can think of. If I read that when I was a kid, I would find that fascinating. It seems like Kirby appeals to a lot of people when they're children, when like. Which, I mean, a lot of people would argue much of the comic books or the superhero medium should be aimed at children.
Well,
because of its wish fulfillment and its simplistic morality.
Let me point this out. There's a really, I should have had that book out. There's this one book on comic book history, more emphasizes on the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which is, it took an interesting, instead of harping over and over again on the Golden Age, which the Golden Age, the Golden Age it's the Golden Age, but it's pretty crude. They said, like, I love Green Lantern and Green Arrow when Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil did and they did a very topical, talked about Martin Luther King and the population explosion and the feminism and all these subjects, and it was really timely. And Green Arrow's ward is on drugs and blah, blah, blah.
Speedy being a heroin addict.
Yeah, exactly. And all this was stuff going on. And they said that, yeah, that's cool. It's a great book, but it's kind of timely. Whereas you look at the New Gods, it's not timely. It is comic books. It is a universal mythology comic book. It's not even superheroes. What is it?
Third issue, one of the clear things was that like there's this blaxploitation thing with Black Rider where, and then when he brings in like the gangster stuff and like Darkseid's like or Orion's having to wear a fake suit and merge in with people. Like I got this vibe that Kirby's just like, I'm tired of these writers telling me what to write. I'm gonna draw what the hell I want and come up and figure out how to line it up.
Well, he's doing 60 pages a month, which is unheard of. Most artists couldn't do that kind of rate.
That is really
amazing rate,
really amazing.
And the that level of quality. If you look at the pencils, that's why.
I will give you that.
And he what he wanted to do was come up with these concepts and hand it off to different artists and writers. But DC didn't want that. They wanted Jack to do another Fantastic Four. They wanted another Thor, and they wanted those kind of sales, and they wanted Jack to do it. And Jack was totally, again, he got frustrated. He finally left DC, went back to Marvel because he couldn't do what he wanted to do. He let him do a couple of black and white magazines. DC didn't even put the logo on the magazines, Days of the Mob and Spirit World. And they did a house ad for it, but it was really, they almost like, we're not going to let this succeed. So it's Jack, and of course, and Jack wants to put food on the table for his family. He's a working man.
It's one of the essentials that a lot of comic book artists to this day still point out that the monthly deadline is the god that's hovering over their head when they're making.
Who's that one writer? David Gould, David Glenn Gould. Are you familiar?
Yeah,
right.
He wrote. Sunny Side.
Right. Yeah, he wrote the intro for this, one of the new Fourth World Companions.
Yeah,
he talks about
Ted radio, not video.
Yeah, he in the intro, he's funny because he points out that Darkseid has a son called Calabac. He's just this giant monster-looking character. He shows up in New York City at issue 5 at the end, ranting and on top of a skyscraper, and he points out that I think Jack forgot that he did that because the storyline goes 2 more issues before he gets back to Calabac in New York City, and that Jack was just going 40,000 miles a minute, and Mark, the 2 boys that were there, Mark Evanier and Steve Sherman, were helping Jack as his assistants. They said, Jack. Well, this goes back to Marvel's day. Jack couldn't remember details on uniforms. He would, and that's why they had everything because he's just going. He'd do 1 page. And he started on the next page. And then when he finished the issue of Fantastic Four, he starts on Thor.
There's a speculation that in the modern market, one of the reasons so many artists can't maintain a monthly deadline is because of the reprinting. The fact that a lot of these comics are going onto the newsstand and then disappearing, except to collectors who keep them. Whereas now, ever since the comics renaissance, like in comics going into bookstores, trade paperbacks have been the source for a lot of people reading comics who aren't buying the monthly pamphlets. All right, we are over a half hour into the episode, and we are only on to one topic. So let's move on to.
Well, should we just come down to the genesis of my revelation
Genesis.
to you?
I like your word.
A Genesis revelation. Remember, these talks when we first met.
Sure.
Was basically it came down to 2 things, and I don't. The funny thing is, I don't remember when I started going whole hog on this.
You never fully committed. You just I think there's something here.
Well, because my evolution for Jack, and like I said, that I already mentioned that I moderate a panel, an hour-long.
You started to, and I cut you off.
I do I have come up with an hour-long panel to try to encompass Jack's entire career. When I could barely fit it in an hour, and I can't even leave it open to Q&A unless it goes over an hour.
And we still can't get to Star Wars because you had to fit in the panel.
So yeah, and But so my love and obsession over Jack is grown as I get older and as I dive more into Jack, and more things are, and all his stuff is being reprinted. Almost everything of Jack's, as he's so revered, is being almost everything you can get your hands on everything Jack's done. Two things that have bugged me. In Star Wars, you have the Force. In 1977, the movie comes out. In 1970, 71, actually 72, I think I wrote the date down of the issue where the first time it's mentioned, the Source is what connects the fourth world spiritually.
Okay.
Just like the Force connects the Star Wars.
I see. I was only a few issues in, so what I found fascinating about the Source is it was like a finger in the sky writing with fire.
That was when he first sees it.
But then becomes something more.
It becomes more because everybody. It seems like everybody is, and again, Jack. I don't think Jack's doing so much so fast. He doesn't stay consistent with all of it. But there's basically everybody has a thing called the mother box, their own personal mother box, which to me is the forerunner of everybody has their smartphones. And as
in the new Tom King, Mitch Gerard, Mr. Miracle, it's very distinctly drawn as a smartphone.
Right, and so the mother boxes are different sizes, and they pretty much can do whatever you need. So Mr. Miracle, he's on Earth. He's a New Genesis kid, young man who's on Earth. He's an escape artist that makes his money on Earth. His mother box helps him out doing escapes. The Forever People are kind of Jack's representation of hippies of that time period, and they're a group of kids, and they have a big mother box. They all put their hands on, and they become the thing. They all turn into the Infinity Man, who fights these stories. And then Orion has a mother box, and Orion is the main character of New Gods, and he is his visage of his face. He looks like a nice, normal superhero face. But really, his face is really disfigured and ugly looking, and he has the mother box helps disguise that look by putting on a better face. And the mother boxes are all connected to the Source. I think that's where. I mean, that's my interpretation.
Was there ever any treatment that the Source is somehow religious? Does it ever have any kind of like Buddhist vibes on it?
It's got a powerful spiritual, supernatural connection vibe to it, but I don't think if Jack got to flesh it out or forgot to flesh it out as much as it should have been.
Okay.
That's the one thing. Source Force. I was like, wait a minute, that's really cutting it close. I mean, and then number two, everybody just lost their pants over the Empire Strikes Back when Luke, I'm your father. And it was a big deal, right? When you saw it, was it a big deal? Or you knew it already?
We can get into this, or we can just ignore it. Just because one of the big generational divides is my generation, my brother, all my friends. Star Wars is the North Star, and so I don't remember ever knowing a time where I've never seen Star Wars. I remember.
Do you remember
seeing Star Wars as a kid, and I remember seeing like it all the way from beginning to end, where I was like a moviegoer when I was like 7 or something like that. But Empire and Jedi, I remember as a kid being like, I want to watch the one where there's both the star battle and the sword fight at the end, and which even though New Hope has that too, but
well, I just remember that in Empire, everybody was like, oh wow, Darth and Luke Skywalker, there's father and son. That's oh my. Well, I had that same kind of feeling back in March of '72. The New Gods, number 7. We're into 7 issues before we find this out. It's a story called The Pact, where and it's Jack and his wife Roz consider it their favorite story. And you see the father of New Genesis, he's the opposite of Darkseid of Apocalypse. And his hair, and you see him younger. It's a flashback story, and we find out.
Is this Oberon?
Huh?
Is this Oberon?
No, Oberon's he's a human character on Earth.
We'll get to him later because he has a really cool role in.
But the Pact. So there's this big battle with Steppenwolf. If you're up on your DC movies, Steppenwolf was the big bad guy in the Justice League movie.
The Joss Whedon cut.
So Steppenwolf, they're fighting. And Highfather, decides to go a peaceful route. So they decide, he negotiates with Darkseid, and they come up with this thing called the Pact. They exchange their sons. And at this point, we don't know. We're a couple years into New Gods, Forever People, Mr. Miracle. We're into several issues of these things. We do not know who the father of Mr. Miracle is. We do not know the father Orion is. In this story, the two sons that are exchanged are Orion and Mr. Miracle, whose name is Scott Free.
There's a cool panel, I want to say in issue 2, where it's one of the first cool close-ups of Darkseid's face, where he says like, he must treat him as our enemy, even if he was our son, or something like that. Which is weird because I mean, if he's going at this pace, then he has trouble remembering plot lines. That level of foreshadowing is still pretty cool.
Oh yeah, there were some things that were really he had, but he. And he apparently he would tell Mark and Steve. He would say, "Oh, well, here's the next story," and he would tell them. And then when Steve and Mark would see the drawn pages, it was totally different because Jack's mind was just racing so far ahead. So anyway, the two sons are exchanged, and all of a sudden we find out Darkseid's son, Orion, is the good guy of New Genesis, the main warrior for all the good guys, and Scott Free is raised on Apocalypse, and he's beaten and abused, and one of the abusers is a character called Granny Goodness, is a really fun character.
And like Scott Free, is he married to Big Barda in this?
No, but Barda's a fellow student, a fellow Apocalypse. They're all going through these trainings to become warriors for Apocalypse, and Big Barda is the female Furies, and Scott's over here with they all shave their head off, they are all bald headed, but there's this character called Hyman, who hides down in Apocalypse, and he manipulates Scott to leave Apocalypse. And so I need to back up. The pact is they exchange the sons, and the ideal is if one of the sons leaves the planet of where they've been placed, the war will break out again. So when Scott shows up on Earth,
the war breaks out?
They're back at it again.
Okay.
The New Genesis and Apocalypse. So those two things, the father-son reveal and the Force of Source, I'm like, wow. And I always thought, I'm like, did George read this? Or it just, he actually stumbled on it on his own. George Lucas, I'm just thinking. And I'm like, in 1970, George was 26 years old.
Okay, so, first off, if you do a Google on the internet, after you deliver this theory, your theory of this is like 10, 15 years old from my vantage point. But on the internet, like, I know Paste Magazine had an article on it. I think The Onion may have had an article on it. They cite 3. They cite your 2 reasons, and then they point out, I don't know if you find this generic, but Dr. Doom kind of looks like Darth Vader.
Well, yeah, now that's going.
And then they cite a specific scene. I don't remember which Fantastic Four issue it's from, but it's Dr. Doom standing up from behind a table, probably in Latveria or something like that. And then they reference the sequence in Empire Strikes Back where he gets up behind the dinner table.
The dinner table. In fact, I think that dinner table scene, the Dr. Doom, I should know better. And please don't crucify me, folks. Listen.
You don't know the specific issue tag?
I think that's the episode. I think it's a 2-parter where Jack was riffing off of the Prisoner TV series.
Oh, you have mentioned this to me before.
The FF are invited. They're trapped in a village that Dr. Doom is in charge of. But no. So only reason we haven't talked about Dr. Doom yet is because that's Marvel. That's a Stan Jack thing.
That's not a New God thing.
Yeah, it's not a New God thing. But no. I'm thinking Darth Vader, Darkseid. That's kind of interesting. And then the whole Darth Vader thing is a Dr. Doom riff.
Man behind with a bird mask.
Then of course that's a precedent. It goes back all the way to the Man in Iron Mask and all kinds of stuff. Even though Dr. Doom, I think Stan's version of Dr. Doom and the most perceived version is that he's scarred underneath it really bad.
Yeah.
And that's why he went ahead and put the metal over him to cover that up. Jack later, I don't know if Jack did this initially, but Jack has this theory that Doom is so egotistical and so vain.
I thought it was a John Byrne theory.
Or is it John? Maybe
you had told me it was a John Byrne.
Maybe
theory.
It was John or John riffing off of Jack. I don't know. Or together. I don't know. And now, I didn't really look it up last night.
But he's so vain.
There's this one little tiny scar on his face that made him put the cover all that up, his whole body.
Maybe that is the Jack one, because the story I heard was that there was something along the lines of that he was too impatient to put the mask on while it was still fire.
I think the mask was still hot. That scarred him up. That was a John Byrne, I think. That's a John Byrne.
That's probably what
Where I think Jack's take now, or before he died, or right before he died, was that if you took his mask off, you just see one little tiny scar. He was a good-looking guy.
Which, to be fair, in a really heretical but cool way, Jonathan Hickman's Secret Wars played around with and finally full-blown revealed his face, but then played around with it in a real fun way. So just from a practical standpoint, here's what part of what I'm thinking. So Lucas graduated from USC in '67. Where was Marvel Comics' biggest popularity at, besides maybe kids? College campuses.
Yes.
So Lucas, according to, you might want to go into this a little. There's a filmmaker he went to school with named Edward Sumner. He was working on a movie called The Men Who Made Comics.
Yeah.
And he has Lucas quoted as being a comic book fan, but more talking anthropologically. And, he doesn't get he starts offhand mentions Joseph Campbell, which we'll get into later. But he also talks about that Lucas and his sister had a comic book collection as a kid. And their comic book collection was more based on probably newspaper-based stuff, but it was also Flash Gordon and Prince Valiant type stuff. Those were the time
comic strips, basically.
Yeah, because the introductions he was giving later were things for like he was doing for Scrooge McDuck and I think Prince Valiant or Al Williamson. Something.
Well, Scrooge McDuck is. I mean, you want to? We can go to another avenue where you talk about Indiana Jones, how much he owes to the Scrooge McDuck adventures.
Really.
And
well, then that makes sense.
So, but yeah, I think George is more comic strip oriented, and of course the thing was he wanted to do Flash Gordon. He basically just flat out said, I want to do after American Graffiti, I'm going to do Flash Gordon.
So it's King's Syndicate that does Flash Gordon.
They own.
So
Flash.
He went to New York, I have in the early '70s, and tried to get them to get the rights, and they refused him because they wanted to make the movie with Fellini. And Fellini at the time, I don't know, he was having these like random meetings with Stanley, or at least he had one.
Well, and Fellini was a buddy with comic book artists in France and in Italy and in Europe.
I think that's mainly because he just liked Spider-Man.
And Alan Renee and Fellini both had meetings with Stan.
Well, Alan Renee
had they got the script
Stanley
form.
write a script.
Yeah.
But did Fellini ever have a script?
I don't think they ever got to script format. But
well, anyway, Lucas then gave up on it, and I do want to ask you real quickly because it still sticks out to me. When you first saw THX 1138, first off, does the theatrical open with the Flash Gordon thing, and what did you think of that when you saw it?
I just thought it was in line with more the cold dystopian, bleak science fiction films of the time. Silent Running in 2001.
But I'm talking about the Flash Gordon clip at the very beginning. I don't.
It's been a while. I don't remember.
It is bizarre. Yeah. I didn't know. For a while I thought it was. I didn't know if it was in the theatrical or is it only in the special edition.
I don't remember it, so maybe it was only in the. Only on the DVD, on the home disc. I don't know. That'd be good. That would be something to look up and research. I guess.
Well, because I always point out that he didn't really touch much of American Graffiti except to add sequences, except the opening shot of the movie has an ILM sunset. They replaced the sunset in the background of the episode.
When I was reading up a little bit on this, a lot of this is just off the top of my head, over all the knowledge in my head that's gathered. But I did look up some stuff. I don't think I've really sat down and watched completely back to back all the Flash Gordon serial with Buster Crabbe. But somebody said that if you watch that, you're going to go, oh wow! Comparing it to Star Wars, just like the wipes and the city clouds and all this stuff that you see in the Flash Gordon, you'll see in Star Wars. And I guess that's basically, if I can go ahead, I don't know where you want to. I'm letting you guide this, but
I do want to mention real briefly our last episode guest, Glenn Kenny. He edited a book on Star Wars, and that was one of his main contentions that at the time Star Wars came out, it was considered science fiction. People like him that were really into the new wave of science fiction from the late '60s, early '70s. Really dismiss that theory. Harlan Ellison, Ballard, they would say things along the lines that it's really more people who like Flash Gordon type stuff, where it's adventure stories and like in space, but it's not with lasers, but it's not speculative fiction or anything science based. But where did you want to go?
Well, what I want to say is basically George, it seemed to me, he had no problem name dropping Kurosawa and Hidden Fortress. He had no, and we know about the Flash Gordon attempt, and he has no, and his love for Flash Gordon.
Yeah, I think he's trapped in Flash Gordon.
Yeah, and plus the Flash Gordon has a, you got to understand at one point, every comic book artist wanted to be a comic strip artist. Milton Caniff got on the cover of Time magazine. Al Cap with Little Abner, Alex Raymond. These guys were big superstars amongst the general population. They were as big as anybody, as George Lucas or Spielberg are now, doing the comic strip. But the adventure strips, died out. Peanuts and Calvin and Hobbes and all that stuff came along in Doonesbury, and the strips got smaller and smaller, and then finally the adventures are hardly at all. So he had no problem name dropping these things that are not. But I think it goes back to being comic books, even to this day, because superhero movies are not cinema, according to Martin Scorsese. They're still marginalized. The comic books, in some still weird way, as much as we think they're getting more accepted, it's still marginalized. So I think George didn't want to acknowledge that he was using some comic book sources.
I think you're thinking of this dated. I think whenever it came out, he didn't want to do it, which is why it's bizarre that he hasn't come out and since it. But I don't know if
to help Jack's,
I think he got trapped into the Joseph Campbell is the basis of all I was interested in. I was only interested in sociology.
Tell me about the Joseph Campbell thing. You need to give them a little rundown on that.
The Joseph Campbell theory wrote a book called The Hero of a Thousand Faces. Do we really need to talk this? Because Hero of a Thousand Faces got bastardized by Hollywood screenwriting in so many ways, and it was a bad influence on Hollywood because it made people. Tied 3 acts. It made people do the hero's journey as the basis of every single fucking story. Well, and then the thing that bugs me, which has been pointed out by one of my favorite film critics, Film Crit Hulk, that a lot of bad blockbuster movies always make their second act of the hero doubting himself, and like the Dark Knight of the Soul, as it's described. And in Star Wars, it's the sequence whenever Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru get killed, and you come back to the Luke's house, and you see it's on fire, and their skeletons are on fire, and
searchers.
Sure, but Film Crit Hulk points out that whole sequence between him telling Obi-Wan, "I have to stay home. No, I'll go with you," lasts 11 seconds, and some modern day blockbusters base their entire second act over this like really uncharacteristic, no, I can't accept my destiny. And then the third act's like, I accept my destiny and do what I should have done 40 minutes ago.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like Campbell was just looked at literature and came up with these charts and overview. I mean, Iliad and the Odyssey. I mean, look at. I mean, and of course, nothing's new under the sun, as we all know.
Well, what's fun, a lot of modern day I've seen from it, although I don't know what I think of this guy, but Jordan Peterson seems to be and he seems to be based off Jung, but like a lot of these like what bugs me, and when you do it from a storytelling standpoint, is it's always reductive, where just like the hero does this, and the hero feels this, and this is the hero's journey, and the reductiveness makes writers force themselves into guidelines as opposed to like trying to make a story more evocative of life or how human emotions work.
Yeah, and that's and you said sucking into a guideline. That's the thing about Jack. I don't think he never would put down on paper a guideline. Jack is going off the top of his head. That's why we get some of the continuity and some of the writing he did and some of the errors. But it was just every issue there was a new idea being thrown at you, going, "Oh my gosh, this is cool! Oh, this is cool! This is cool!" Just over and over again until DC pulled the plug on it.
Real briefly, I do want to ask you something. Kirby's influence. One of the things the MCU was really good at with superhero costumes, mainly, was that they adapted a lot of these two-dimensional costume designs. And I was pointing out that Kirby's good at design, but when MCU started doing stuff, they had to like say something like Scarlet Witch's costume, which is supposed to come up in with the WandaVision show. They had to make them look good in film and in movement, and even though film, for the most part, is a 2D medium, it still had to look real.
Yeah.
Where is Kirby's actual influence on film? Because like, you think in the MCU, really all it is Thor Ragnarok.
No, you're just no. Well, I mean, the characters themselves are Jack. You know.
Of course. I'm staying beyond the obvious. I'm talking about his visual influence.
Well,
Because I mean, the Ultimates were one of the biggest designs of that. So
Here's the thing.
I'm not going to single credit.
Well, now we're going to go back to
Brian Hitch is what I was going to say.
I'm going to go back to. Well, then I'm going to have to go back to his. He became the house style. Jack was apparently like one artist, a major artist. I don't want to mention his name, though I read, but he I basically would almost like was in tears because Stan was badgering him. Draw more like Jack. This guy was a romance comic book artist, and he had the Jack's the foreshadowing, the body language, the energy level that Jack was able to show in the Marvel universe when it started up. That's what that became the template of all comic book superhero language. And then, of course, John Buscema took over as a house style.
There's a book I remember from middle school, our middle school library.
John did that.
And one of my pet theories on people will complain that the MCU movies, even as they get all these great auteurs to do it, who give up Final Cut, and then the movies end up looking the same and feeling the same. My pet theory is that they're producer-based movies that have a particular house style for the directors.
Right. So Jack, I mean, if you look at Neil Adams, he brought the super realism to comic books. He was doing a comic strip that was a Ben Casey comic strip before comic books. Gil Kane was over at DC doing this kind of DC had a house style. They thought Jack and Steve Ditko were cruddy artists. Why is this selling? They would look at this stuff. Is it because of the coloring? Maybe it's the coloring that's making it sell.
Who are the notable artists that were doing this? Was like Infantino still?
Well, you got Carmen. Well, when he got bumped up, he didn't draw as much. You got Murphy Anderson and Kurt Swan, and these are probably artists I'm not even sure you.
I know a little Kurt Swan. Kurt Swan would have shit on Kirby.
Well, no. I mean, no, he's not shitting. It's the management.
Management. Sorry,
they're trying to examine why is Marvel selling, because to them it looked like crude. Because Jack was a crude artist. Jack is he's not, his anatomy is. I remember Jim Lee in a documentary saying, I didn't care much for Jack when I was young, and then I started becoming an artist myself, and then I started examining Jack, and I go, oh, that squiggle there, that's muscle texture, and that's I see what he's doing here. And
that's really interesting because Jim Lee was my favorite artist when I was 13.
It was funny too. It's a great documentary on Jack, and all these artists say, "No, I wasn't really a Jack fan originally. I was Jack, or they became they were fans of Jack in his later stage of art, which is even more interesting." But they get to Walt Simonson, and he goes, "Well, I don't know about those other guys, but I was always a fan of Jack Kirby." You were asking me, he brought this energy and stylistic, but you saw like with the X-Men movies, when they decided that predate the MCU, they put them in leather jackets because they didn't think the spandex.
They were still doing the Matrix, and like there's that really great moment in Whedon, John Cassidy, Astonishing X-Men #1, where they're just like, we have to leave the spandex behind. We're superheroes.
We have to. Yeah, there has to be Nobody's been brave enough to really just go full tilt in it. But the funny thing is, in the first Captain America movie, when Chris Evans is in that propaganda Captain America outfit, that's really the Captain America outfit with spandex, and it doesn't seem to be that bad, does it?
Well, it's especially better than the Whedon's first X-Men or first Avengers movie too.
So,
but let me real quickly. One of my favorite artistic things that I do love about Kirby, although I loved how other artists took it on and did it. Have you ever seen Kirby dots in a movie?
Well, you get to see him finally in Ragnarok. I mean, that's what you see.
Where are they in Ragnarok?
In the background, the design on the walls, I think.
Are they like energy bubbles, or how do they work?
Crackle, the Kirby crackle. I don't know if we've really.
Because there's such a great comic book design. When I was a teenager, I loved the shit.
I wonder if somebody's. I'm trying to think of if that's been. But yeah, there's the design work on the walls and stuff in Ragnarok, very Kirby-esque. I mean, very pronounced Kirby. But here's something I wanted to throw at you, and this is going to be, like I said, this is maybe too radical and weird. In some ways, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is actually a step backwards in terms of where the superhero genre can lead to, because when Jack was doing New Gods, and you look at it and examine it, it's like, what is this? Is this a science fiction? Is this fantasy? Is this even superheroes? These are gods fighting amongst each other with the earth as a backdrop. And that was a lot of people. So people still want. I want Daredevil. I want I want a guy with a cape. And a lot of kids could not sink into that. So okay, so that's like, that was a step forward. So now we get Star Wars in '77. We get the Matrix we get the Star Wars and Matrix before we get comic book movies.
I will admit, as someone who is a weekly comic book reader with a bunch of superhero crime fighters, I find I don't know if we've ever talked about this on the episode before, but we've talked about this in person. The superhero concept is so goddamn fascist. It is so, this idea.
And it's very insular too.
Well, crime needs to be stopped by having people swing around and beat up people without a trial. And it's so, and like, one of my favorite current writers is Brian Michael Bendis, and when he switched to DC, they used the similar ads that they used when Kirby came over. It said in Superman's logo letters, it said Kirby is coming, and then when Bendis came over, it said Bendis is coming. But he has this tendency to write that like these superheroes come from a place that they need to change the world for better and they need to do something about it, but then they turn around and beat up crime, and like there's always a bank robbery, and like it leads people to believe that crime is much worse, which allows to like more let the police do whatever they need to be doing to solve these crimes that may or may not be happening.
It's a cul-de-sac, intellectual cul-de-sac. I mean, I keep on thinking, I need to read, great literature before I die, instead of reading guys in pajamas beating up each other.
I guess I just heard the other day argument for more graphic-based nonfiction, just because it's way more effective. It communicates stronger to people who don't read more consistently. It's probably a cooler or warmer medium, to use the McLuhan term. But anyway.
But do you see what can you see what I'm a little bit of I'm saying? It was a step forward in terms of comic book characters and storytelling, and the whole fact that 4 books were interlocked and going back and forth and like an onion. It was like unpeeling like an onion.
I mean, I'm a huge fan
in 1970, 71. This is not, it hadn't been done before. There had been crossovers, but nothing at this degree. So we get Star Wars and Matrix and other films because they were able to pull off the special effects. We couldn't, because when you get to the third Matrix and you got the Neo fighting, what's his name?
It's basically
it's two superheroes banging each other. It's Captain Marvel and Superman fighting each other. I mean, we finally got to a point where we could pull off the superhero realistically, but that's actually going backwards because of this.
I think you need to laser down on this theory. Are you trying to attribute that they're just expanding genre? Are they becoming mythological? Is that what you think it is?
I think, it's, well, some have said that after the Watchmen comic book, not the movie. The Watchmen comic book is like, there's no need to do any more superhero comic books. It's the be all end all there. We've reached after 1939, Superman shows up, and then we get to 1985, 86. What else is there to do? Where can you go? But the next step is on the Kirby New Gods Fourth World level.
I guess I would go with the Warren Ellis, Mark Miller Authority stuff, where they have to start changing, or Miracle Man.
But that's commenting and deconstructing.
No, it's not. It's like, what if a character was really that big, they would have to change the world somehow.
Right, and I mean that's what Watchmen, was.
All right,
ground zero.
Okay, there's also, getting back to the thesis of the episode, John Marrow, who's a editor for the...
John Morrow.
Morrow. Did I say Edward?
Marrow. I thought you said Marrow. Yeah, Morrow. I guess his company's called Two Morrows.
Not St. Vincent, Edward R. Okay, gotcha. He is quoted as saying, "There are too many similarities for me to believe Kirby wasn't some kind of influence on Lucas." I wanted to then turn back onto Lucas. We are recording on the day that David Prowse died, Darth Vader died, and we're also recording in a week where you haven't watched any of The Mandalorian yet, but The Mandalorian this week had a very particularly Kurosawa based episode where like the force in the episode was straight from Ron. The forest was based from Ron, and the city was based out of Seven Samurai. I wanted to go into some other potential influences on Star Wars. We just watched beforehand this short from the National Film Board of Canada called 2187 by Arthur Lipsett, and you had a very great reaction to it, which was, why did we watch this?
Well, it was funny once you said that about the forest. I mean, I did think that a little bit. I was looking for Star Wars connections.
The short mentions the Force in a religious context,
Yeah.
even though it's mentioned as like this non-diegetic guy talking randomly about religion. He says it's Force that combines people.
I'm just saying, if you had shown that to me with that, with this topic in our mind, I think I would never have thought about Star Wars watching it.
What bugs me in the other, I was watching it for the first time too with you, and it really, my bugaboo over the years with Lucas is he's talked forever about he wants to do these tone poems, artistic based stuff, and he wants to get away from the movies he boxed himself into, the blockbusters with Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and especially if you look at the THX 138 Blu-ray DVD, they have a lot of his college shorts on there, and they're very similar to this 2187. And it was bugged me over the years. There's been nothing stopping him since pretty much 1983 to be making these movies. Especially he's retired twice. It feels like.
I mean, yeah, he could make. He could just take his time and do whatever. I mean, I'm one of these people that I know Star Wars people will ride me or tar and feather me when I say this, but I don't think he had. Trilogies in mind when he did the first one.
He very clear. Or he clearly Well, you've had this theory that. Everyone has this theory. He had no idea. He didn't want to do beyond one movie.
It's made. When you watch it, if you really watch it, and not just I'm a Star Wars fan, and try to think about the continuity and history. If you just watch it objectively, as much as objectively as you can, it's the whole idea is that you drop in on a Saturday morning serial,
you start in
and you
media res,
leave
yeah.
it,
Well, there's a quote, I reread it today from our past guest, Paul Hirsch's book. They were talking about the very end of the movie after the Death Star blows up, and Lucas came in one day and said, hey, I want to get in a shot of Darth Vader escaping. And it was after they reshot, so Hirsch had to work in some heads and tails of a shot where they had a spinning camera on a spinning mount, and so they make it look like the mount is correcting itself and then flying away, and they use some other shot to set up that Darth Vader survived.
Yeah. Well, and I guess we should go. We're Kurosawa. You brought up the Kurosawa. And of course, I'm thinking about everybody. The first thing I heard the first episodes, everybody was going spaghetti western.
It is really weird.
And of course,
it's very
what did Sergio do? And he got in trouble. Fistful of Dollars is a direct ripoff of Ojimbo.
Yeah,
so they're tied together.
And what's funny is this episode is also a Ujimbo / Red Harvest kind of riff. Although what's frustrating is, I love the look of the Mandalorian show, and this is totally another riff, maybe another episode. My feelings about Jon Favreau as a filmmaker, writer, but they make it so obvious that he comes to town, he's like, I gotta play off sides. It's very much like Kirby overwriting, where he has to explain something that seems pretty obvious.
And then of course we ought to mention, we can't, again, George is never. I guess the big deal. This whole Shane has dragged me into this. That the whole big deal is that it'd be nice if George would throw some flowers toward Jack. Because he has no problem with Alex Raymond and Kurosawa and Riefenstahl with the end.
I think that's been credited.
I'm saying.
Oh, you're right.
I'm saying
he can credit a
that's
Nazi,
because,
but he can't credit Jack.
Yeah, because that's film history. It's for film buffs. It's more legit in terms of in the popular culture. But again, it goes back to comic books being over in this little corner. I remember one of my friends mentioned how one time he said comic books is the pimple on the butt of pop culture, because it's just.
Well, that's a problem. It's not anymore. It's very clearly.
Well, you think it is, but it's again, Well,
no, I don't think it is. I think mainstream superhero comics are, and rightfully so. But you look at I don't know, Adrian Tomine or something like that. He's or Art Spiegelman.
Dan Klaus and Hernandez brothers.
I think even the snobbiest New Yorker reader knows. Oh, they've been doing my covers for a while.
Right. We all should mention that now that Disney bought up Marvel, Disney's got this this Hall of Fame, imagination engineers or innovators or something. They came up with this. It's a it's
the Imagineers thing.
Imagineers thing, and they do a presentation and have people talk, and they give out I guess there's somewhere in the Disney headquarters or somewhere there's these a trophy on the wall or whatever, and there's a booklet on it or something, and they made Jack one of them up there on the stature of Walt Disney. So I mean, Jack is getting. I just think it's going to be a long haul, but I think and again, you've watched it with me, and you saw what Tom King did with this Mr. Miracle. It's just this really.
Do we want to talk Mr. Miracle? Tom King's Mr. Miracle?
You wanted to. So,
oh my God! Because what happened was I pledged to. When I first introduced this episode, we had some bad miscommunication because I was going to read New Gods and I was going to try to read Mr. Miracle. We were both going to watch Hidden Fortress, and in my back of my head, I kind of wanted to reread the Tom King Mr. Miracle, the Eisner-winning series from it's only like 2 or 3 years.
Oh, it's
old.
Wonderful! It's wonderful.
Oh my God!
I've had some people that I respect to slog it too. But.
Well, I want to hear that in a second, but what ended up happening was I read 3 issues of New God and jumped right away and just reread the Tom King series, and it's so good. But it is also literally a series that calls Jack Kirby God because he appears as Oberon in there, and he is God in multiple issues. When he dies, his gravestone is Oberon Kurtzberg, was his
Jack's real name.
Name. His real first name was Jacob, so the child is named Jacob in there. He's based off a character called the Lump. Is that? Do you?
There's a character. There's a.
By the way, spoiler that halfway through the series they have a kid.
Oh, by the way, there's an episode in Mr. Miracle where Oberon and Scott are in a compactor getting.
Really?
Where have we seen that before?
Yeah, I'm going to bring that back up when we get around to Hidden Fortress. But Big Barda is supposedly based off Roz Goldenstein's Jack's wife.
Well, in terms of the relationship, probably, but not the look. He actually based that on what's her name, Lady Kazan, whatever. I'm saying her name wrong. He saw a Playboy pictorial that.
Well, and then who's the
Lady Kazan? I don't know.
Funky character in there?
Funky Flashman is Stan Lee. Was
he always in the New Gods?
Yes. Jack was still pretty pissed at Stan, so he made a parody of Stan and Roy Thomas.
Okay, so in Tom King Mitch Gerard miniseries, there's this basically they have the kid, and so the kid's nanny is Funky, and he's based off Stan Lee, and he talks like Stan Lee, and he at one point keeps calling Jacob Genius Jack over, and there's this point late in it where they describe coming up with a variant. It involves like a Silver Surfer being a golden retriever, but Jacob, as an infant who can't talk yet, comes up with this imagination story and convincing Scott that's like, oh, your son came up with we came up with this story together. And Funky's like, I come up with the words, and Jack comes up with the imagination, is the way it's phrased in the comic. And this is barely. There's a cigar aspect. There's just this series is so damn good because it's also about the nature of existence, and it opens with a suicide attempt. It gets dark, depression. Why didn't your friends like this?
No, I'm not saying friends. I'm saying people in the industry. I didn't read the. I can't give you.
There's
specifics.
An argument to be made, and King has 2 comics out right now. He's redoing Rorschach and he's doing Strange Adventures. And like the first few issues, it takes a while before it reveals what the thing's about.
Oh, I know. It's a noted cartoonist and comic book creator. He says no. Tom King didn't get it at all. It's not anything resembling Kirby, and I'm not sure if that's the point there, but
what was his argument? Do you remember?
I don't remember the argument.
And is he beholden to representing Kirby?
He loves Kirby. He's a big Kirby fanatic.
But I mean, okay, but yeah. I mean, I set you up to ask for this, and if you don't have it,
going back to you say, the dialogue with the New Gods. That's another big thing. I think I've talked to you over the years about. So where does comic book writing start becoming sophisticated enough that you're not embarrassed? Because even as much as Stanley, it was a step up in writing. Some of that stuff, if you read it now, even that's kind of hard to read as Stan stuff.
Yeah, and you're arguing my argument when you're the one that loves this stuff too.
Yeah, well, I was there. That's a sentimental, nostalgic. It could be the tyranny of nostalgia playing a game on me. But I think let me they brought out. Let me point out one other thing about the New Gods. he had these 4 titles, and he was it was like an onion. He was really like how these all interconnected, and what was the point of that? And he's his own editor. He doesn't have he's dialoguing in himself. It's almost like an opera. Jack is bombastic. By this point in his artwork, he doesn't have he found an inker, Mike Royer, that ink his pencils the way they are. He's in your face. The artwork is in your face. It's big. The Kirby crackle, the explosions, the gestures, and the dialogue maybe kind of matches that. It's so operatic and big, and everybody talks in boldface and exclamations. Now, the point out. Well, they're
I'm
telling
giving
you
you a skeptical look.
Well,
here.
I think I know, and I got Tom Stillbar, who runs the book broker. He goes, I like the look of the New Gods. I like the ideals, but I just can't get past the dialogue. Jack needs a writer. Jack needed an editor, and there's a lot of people that say that Jack needed an editor, a writer. But the whole thing about writing, repeating what you're writing that shows what it's in the panel. That still was a stigma of that day. Some of the best writers, Englehart, a lot of the '70s guys, Marvels, they were still under the sway of Stan Lee and still under the sway of not knowing that you don't have to explain everything in comic book artwork.
Well, let me ask you in those terms, did you read the Star Wars Marvel comic books when they first came out?
I read I collected the adaptation issues, but then when it went
the
beyond...
first few were done by Roy Thomas and Howard Chaykin?
Yes.
Chaykin he did through like issue 11, I think, or something like
and
that.
And Chaykin is totally embarrassed by that. Chaykin will be the first person to tell you, he goes, you get to see all my mistakes and warts and how I grew as an artist right in front of your eyes.
He wasn't a star at the time, then.
No, he wasn't. He was nowhere near the big star he is now.
Okay.
Well, in terms of us in the comic book industry, Chaykin is a legendary name now. But
well, I got and then Archie Goodwin took over as writer after a certain point, and then I have Carmen Infantino being involved.
Yeah,
somewhat.
he drew some issues.
He was still drawing.
He got fired from DC eventually. They didn't like, and so he has to start going become a work for hire artist again.
And then later we got David Michelin, who I was writing Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man when I first started, and Walt Simonson started drawing for it.
Walt did some more, yeah.
Was Walt Simonson okay with what he did?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, that's Walt getting. That's probably before he got to Thor, and that of course his
style grew from there.
Well, I mean, he had an early on hit, a cult hit called Manhunter, which was actually riffing off of a Kirby, Joe Simon, Jack Kirby character. But I digress. But he.
But do you?
He revised the Thor. Thor, at one point you had John Byrne doing the Fantastic Four, the best run since Jack was on it. You had Frank Miller totally revising Daredevil and Brendan Electra. And then you had Walt Simonson doing Thor.
Beta Ray Bill era.
Yeah, Beta Ray Bill, and it revitalized Thor, hugely.
Well, when I look at this list of people, like when I remember reading a few issues and not really thinking much of it, and maybe it fits into what you're talking about writing wise.
Well, yeah, but also you got to admit, there's a certain kind of comic book fan collector. The diehard, I mean, really, one that it's been my whole life. I don't have a memory of not having comic books around me. That's how I'm 62 years old now, and we were always leery of adaptations, comic books based on movies or based on TV series. That was not pure comics. That was more like, and a lot of times, the adaptations were just like it was just more. They had to beg. Well, they had to ask Marvel to do one. The Marvels almost didn't really want to bother it.
Did you want to read that section you were talking about earlier when we were talking about Edward Sumner, the thing? Because you'd had this theory for a long time that Lucas was invested in a comic book store.
Yeah, I had heard rumors of that, and again, my biggest thing is that he's 26 years old when the New Gods are starting. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking, and I'm thinking a 26-year-old George Lucas is not going to be reading comics anymore.
Maybe.
Or do you think? I don't know.
I mean, he might.
Yeah, but he's of a generation that didn't stay with comic books as my generation. Or your generation.
No, that makes sense.
He also had a lot.
He was of a generation whose parents threw out their collections
and a lot of different things. He had.
That was clearly his where his
So I'm wondering,
interests were.
but if he was a co-owner of a comic book store or was keeping track of stuff, and there's a picture of him with Frank Frazetta together. And,
Wow, okay.
And I'm thinking, okay, if they know Frazetta, there's another way in, because before Frazetta was the Conan paperback artist, he was doing EC Comics and he was doing comic books.
Lucas does single out EC Comics at one point as a comic he was reading in the 50s.
Yeah,
that was the one clear comic beyond the strips, beyond
that's early 50s, and or it'd be in the neighborhood, the used copies. But anyway, in this book by Tales to Astonish by Ronan Rowe, I'll just read it here. It's not that long. The irony was that Marvel told Kirby his ideas were old-fashioned. This is back when Jack came back to Marvel in the 70s. And just when so they said, "Oh, Jack, your stuff is old-fashioned." Just when a new movie, including identical elements, was about to forever change everything about the Hollywood film industry, the movie was Star Wars. With Marvel sales at an all-new low, Roy Thomas went to dinner with Ed Summer, owner of the Super Snipe Comic Emporium on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Accompanying Summer was film director George Lucas, Summer's old film school classmate, a silent partner in the store, and creator of American Graffiti, one of Roy's favorite movies. During the meal, Thomas didn't pay much attention to Lucas's discussion of a movie called The Star Wars, but he did feel Lucas had been reading a few Jack Kirby comics. I don't know if George Lucas ever admitted it, Thomas would say later, but I got the impression in my conversation with him that there was a little bit of influence there. And Roy Thomas was the editor-in-chief, I think, at the time. And, of course, Marvel, I think Jim Shooter has been quoted as saying that the Marvel Star Wars comic book helped save Marvel at the time.
Okay. Well, because the reason I brought it up is when I look at that status of artists that they had, writers on there, it reminds me, I am a huge fan of, after Lucasfilm sold and Disney took over, Marvel got back Star Wars, which had been a Dark Horse forever, and I don't really remember reading any Dark Horse comics, but Marvel's Star Wars comics are super, super good. They started, and they brought
the new ones,
and they brought out big names for it. The first, they have one series that's 1 to 75 that takes place between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, and it opened with Jason Aaron doing about 40 issues, and they got this style so well. But the first artist was John Cassidy, who was just absolute fucking superstar. He only did like 5 issues, and then they switched over to a bunch of different artists, but most notably Stuart Immonen, who is almost as good as John Cassidy. And beyond how great, eventually they'd have people like Greg Pak and Charles Soule take over, and some of those were lesser issues, but they're still pretty good. But one thing that, if after the first few trades of it, it was consistently, there's 3 different series of Darth Vader. We're starting on the 3rd one right now, but the first 2 were written by Kieran Gillen and Charles Soule. And both of them are super, super good. The first series is this riff on it's Vader after he lets the Death Star get destroyed, and they make it look like Breaking Bad, where he's having to fight to get the Emperor's attentions again. And then the next series and this current one do a lot of legwork to compare psychologically Vader as the kid from the prequels versus the Vader we know from the original trilogy.
Well, and this just goes to show you how the industry has changed and comic books have changed and evolved. Like I told you earlier, we were always leery of adaptations, and they were sloughed off to. There was just a quick buck for Marvel. They did a Buckaroo Banzai. They did Dune. Sienkiewicz illustrated Dune. I was intrigued by the artwork, but I didn't really consider it, a real comic book or a real adaptation. It was just like, oh, there's some Sienkiewicz artwork. That's great. But it was just and funny. So that's old school thinking. Now you have Alien comic books. You have Star Wars comic books.
It's hit or miss. This is why I'm so surprised.
Buffy,
this is good.
Buffy and
Buffy's Buffy was good for a while. Buffy's terrible now.
Well, but they actually call them seasons, like the extended from TV.
None of the new one since Dark Horse lost
and Angel and Serenity and all these are. And you're right. They're all hit and miss, but there's some really good stuff being done and some extension being done. And as long as it has official people, but it's kind of funny. This really low rank company called Moonstone, they got the rights to Buckaroo Banzai. They had actually got W.D. Richter and Errol Mac Roush involved, but they didn't have the artists. They didn't have the really creative people they needed to really execute it well.
Well, I was going to say this Star Wars comic, the special editions changed in a very stupid way where Vader found out about Skywalker, and they changed the dialogue in a really undramatic way. In the middle of Empire, he finds out that his son was the rebel that destroyed the Death Star. But in the comics, there is an amazing scene where like it is oh, it's so good, where Vader finds out, and I don't want to spoil it. It's just such a great scene where he finds out and how Vader reacts.
Yeah, but and like I said, there's been really good stuff in terms of licensing character from the movies and other sources.
Well,
that we were always a little bit trepidatious about it.
So we're pretty far along into how long we've been talking about this. We didn't even get to Hidden Fortress.
I haven't. Be honest, I haven't watched mine. I can't find my copy. But the R2. You watched it today. So
I was going to ask, do you want me to talk about it since I?
Well, just mention the things that he takes from it.
The thing is, I didn't make it. When we first introduced the idea of doing this episode, you're like, watch Hidden Fortress, and I was like, do we need to rehash it? Because basically it seems like it doesn't take much knowledge to know that C-3PO and R2-D2 being your guide way into the storyline is taken from the Kurosawa 1958 movie, The Hidden Fortress. But to be fair, Kurosawa's influence, my viewing of Kurosawa's in general and being underseen, like Kurosawa's all over Lucas. He's almost equally as much.
Well, and even produces. Remember they
Kurosawa's Dreams, and he did Keiji and I don't know. He put some money into Ron.
Well, Coppola did. I forgot one. Lucas did one of those, and I think Coppola did both of them. Ron, but they all got produced by those guys.
I was just looking up in the ILM book in Dream that ILM did a shot, and Kurosawa just kept saying no, too realistic, and having them do the shot over and over. But there's a bunch of different stuff. Hidden Fortress has
princess.
They're going after a princess who they're trying to. It's a small band of people involving a general on a losing side or the small side, trying to sneak through a thing. There's a sequence that remind me of the trash compactor sequence you mentioned earlier, where the two buffoons fall down the hill. The difference is that the two buffoons bicker, but unlike R2-D2 and C-3PO, like they're constantly trying to steal the gold at the center of the plot. There's a.
All right, now let me ask you this:
they do a fake princess bit, which isn't in A New Hope, but is in Phantom Menace, and is badly in Phantom Menace because it's like one of Keira Knightley's first roles. And I remember when I first saw Phantom Menace and liked my first viewing of Phantom Menace, even then I could tell this is a bad switch off of a fake princess.
What about the two buffoons in Hidden Fortress and C-3PO, 3PO, R2-D2 and C-3PO? Do you see also Lauren Hardy influence in them? I mean,
maybe
that's such a basic trope. The comedy duo.
There's a thing in Phantom Menace where there's the direct CGI quote of Buster Keaton with Jar Jar Binks.
Oh yeah, the going down the stones rolling down the hill.
I mean
the two lovable characters. They like each other, but they bicker, and that's such Lauren Hardy. It's so Lauren Hardy.
I guess. I think there's when comparing Jar Jar Binks to like R2-D2 and C-3PO, there's so much more functionality with C-3PO and R2-D2 fighting with each other. Really early on, the two buffoon characters get separated and come back together.
And again, I guess I'm getting back to our basis of this whole discourse we're having is that George, has no problem acknowledging these sources. I just have been nice. Is he hiding this, or he just it was just an accident, something in the air, or did he really take from Jack? And it'd just be cool to have Jack acknowledged, because as we find out with the MCU movies and comic book history, that Jack has been such a great influence. And I mean, and has his, but everybody thinks if anybody knows anything about comics, Stan Lee.
No, see that's when we first started having these conversations. I was very dismissive of Jack Kirby, but I was also doing the snide Stan Lee. actually my advantage was that Jack Kirby. I took the side maybe Jack Kirby wrote more than he's given credit for because of that. And Stan Lee being a writer who he has a certain talent set, but as and he's a certain storytelling set that he's very talented at. But there's being that some of the stuff is childish and readable to me as an adult. I was very hard on him, and I was very hard on him also because of the fact that he was so denying of Kirby's credit or Ditko's credit. And over the years, right before he died, I feel like the tide of his reputation started to turn. There was a great New York Magazine article a few years ago that very head-on addressed this problem of him taking credit and staying with the company and making money with the company while, and it's not just those big artists, it's all the other artists who, like, there's a story that Marvel had work for hire contracts on the back of the checks the artists signed. So when they endorsed the check to get the money, they had to hand over their work for hire.
Yeah, industry was it's a messed up industry.
It's always been that bad,
and it's always and a lot of guys have been open-eyed about John Byrne. I read an interview with John Byrne last night. He says, Siegel, he goes, it wasn't unfair what happened to Siegel and Schuster. They openly sold the rights. It was a paltry sum, but and then he says, yeah, Ditko and Jack knew Steve and Jack knew what they were doing, but John's a very
well, that
guy.
argument also a lot of people who have really shit on Alan Moore in the last few years, they put that to him with Watchmen, and Ed Brubaker comes to his defense on that, where no, they're like, this is before trade paperbacks took over, and Dave Gibbons, Alan Moore's contract for Watchmen said that when the comic goes out of print, they get the rights back, and no one knew. It's just like when the writer's strike in TV or movies happened a few years ago to fight for internet. They knew internet was on the horizon, and the profits from there were going to happen.
Yeah, and I mean, it's such a quagmire and a messy thing. And talking about Stan Lee, I'm not on the anti Stan Lee bandwagon. It was like Lennon McCartney. You need the two. There was something about the two of those coming together at that moment, at that time, that made it work. But here's a really interesting thing. Think about what sticks out. What did Stan Lee create prior to meeting Jack and Steve in that 60s? Well, before that and after that, what sticks out that Jack's created? Stan's created. I mean,
I get it. I agree with it. I see it, and it's indisputable the popularity of what they created. There's a tiny part of me that wants to argue that the baby boom generation just hit their imagination years at the exact right time.
Oh no, yeah. I mean, that's another. Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's a really messy argument and discussion, and I think we could keep this going for another couple hours if you really wanted to, because the whole history of comic books, especially, is so,
I still have a bunch of stuff on my notes, but we need to wind down.
Really?
So, oh God, we can't. Let's not go. Do you have any?
No, I do want to address. Wrapping up here, there's an artist, Carla Speed McNeil.
Yeah, she's great. Find her.
This is they had an exhibit of Jack Kirby artwork. They put together a booklet. They put the essays, and she wrote her essay. He goes, this is her. I'm quoting her. He goes, but the more I try to read The Fourth World, and I desperately want to, the harder going it is. It's like drinking from a fire hose. Perhaps I've come to it too late. I might reflect about how you're approaching it.
Yeah,
it's like a fire hose just knocking you down, and it's almost like maybe I'm just too late to it. But you're benefiting from all these things that he came up with during those Fourth World books. Yeah. And by the way, if you guys, for those out there who want to investigate this more about Jack Kirby and his place, and Star Wars connections beyond, even Kubrick connections and all kinds of stuff, I highly recommend this ongoing magazine. Sometimes the issues are even hardback, called the Kirby Collector. We mentioned John Morrow before, but if you really, I really want to do a big plug for John. He does a great job. He started this magazine about the time of Jack passed away, and it's an entire publishing company with all kinds of great magazines and books in the comic book industry. But the Kirby Collector by John Morrow, check it out.
I knew from the get-go when I first proposed this that I had the feeling you wanted to also get really deep into the origins of Star Wars, and we were never going to get that.
No, like I said, it really comes down to those two things: Source Force and the Father-Son reveal. Those are the two biggies. I would just think.
And the thing that when you start looking into where Star Wars came into, the impressive thing really is that Lucas really did draw on a lot of different.
Oh yeah, it's a kitchen sink. It's like you can sit there and just do a whole lexicon, which I'm sure people have.
I would hope by this time this year, if the pandemic hadn't happened, I had hoped to have finally read Frank Herbert's Dune, which always seems like a big influence on the movie. I wanted to close Kirby wise. This quote is been used a lot lately. It's used actually not just in Tom King, Mitch Gerard's Mr. Miracle, but also their follow-up with Doc Shanier. Was it Doc?
Shanover?
Evan?
Shanover.
Their new comic, Strange Adventures, it's in there too, but Jack Kirby's one of the pillars of the medium said comic books will break your heart.
Oh yeah.
I guess that's it for this episode. Ted, thank you for being on it again.
Long live the king.
Long live the king.
Jack King Kirby.
And long live the length of this episode. Thanks everybody for listening.